Welcome, fine people, to the Nikhil Hogan Show. My guest today is Professor Mark Ferraguto. He is an Associate Professor of Musicology at Penn State University. He will talk to us about his very interesting book, Beethoven 1806, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Professor Ferraguto, so glad to have you on the show.
It's an honor to be here.
Let's start at the beginning. Can you talk a little bit about your background and the path that led you to your book, Beethoven 1806?
Sure. So I actually became really interested in Beethoven as an undergraduate, and somehow that, I kept trying to get away from him. In graduate school, I was exploring, trying to maybe do a dissertation topic on passions by Jomelli and Galuppi and all kinds of other 18th century stuff. But then I just kept coming back to Beethoven and realizing that, there are certain issues in the way he's been talked about and written about that sort of bothered me. And I guess that I sort of followed these up. And my background is both in musicology and in performance practice. At Cornell, where I did my PhD, there was a strong emphasis in historical instruments and historical performance practices. That was something that became really integral to my thinking about this period and about Beethoven specifically. And some of the book reflects, I think, that orientation too.
You mentioned things that bothered you a little bit about how Beethoven was perceived, analyzed, looked upon. Can you talk about a few of those things?
Sure. I think with Beethoven, there's been so the thing with Beethoven is his life was very difficult. He suffered from deafness, which began around 1800 and then increased toward the end of his life. He had trouble with relationships, whether it was with women or with his own family. His nephew, he cared deeply for, but he didn't treat him particularly well. There were all these really, legal battles and stuff like that. And so I think that aspect of Beethoven has really driven the way we think about him. And it's really driven the way we think about his music, because there are these kind of pre-existing narratives, and they were really pumped up in the late 19th century. Okay. And so it kind of has led people to really focus on these pieces that work with those narratives, the pieces that represent struggle and difficulty. And also this just idea of like triumph through adversity, which is like a big part of Beethoven's music, but it's not the only part. And so there are all these little moments in his life and different ways of approaching music that I think have been kind of swept under the rug because people have been so eager to project this particular vision of Beethoven.
Is it fair to say that Beethoven himself is a little bit to blame for this in the way that he conducted himself, perhaps to market himself?
That's a really good question. And I think you're absolutely right that he wanted people to see him a certain way. I think he wanted to be taken very seriously as a composer and as a performer. The way he interacted with publishers, for example, he was not beneath basically calling out reviewers and saying, "You've done me a disservice here. We need to start again. You need to publish some good reviews about my music because I'm not going to stand for this." He really sort of controlled the media perception of himself as much as he could, and I think it's sort of been inflated though in the 19th century that it kind of got away from Beethoven the man and turned into the myth. And if you look at some of the iconography of the late 18th century where he's depicted as a monumental hero, there are these images of him where he's enthroned in the clouds. We're a mountain man. It becomes something.
There's like a
big,
famous painting of Liszt at the piano and all these fawning people around him, and there's a bust of Beethoven at the piano.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that's it. He became kind of a monument, and to the 19th century certainly, and people like Liszt idolized him, and Wagner as well, and that. We in a way are viewing Beethoven through their lens too.
There's a really interesting quote, and you said it's an anecdote that's alleged, so we don't know if it actually happened, but it's something like this. He was talking to a violinist, and he said, "What do I care about your wretched fiddle when the spirit seizes me?" Something like that.
Right. Yeah, I think he did have that streak of, I don't know if you want to call it egotism. I guess it was egotism, self-assured of his own abilities and maybe even his own greatness. Okay. He said about his quartets that they were not composed for this age, but for a later age. It's quite a bold thing to say about your own music.
That's fantastic. Well, okay, so you were interested in Beethoven. Now, how did you come to choosing this particular year, 1806?
The pieces that Beethoven wrote in 1806, there are quite a few of them. The Fourth Piano Concerto, the Fourth Symphony, the Violin Concerto. There's a set of C minor variations, 32 variations on an original theme, and a couple of other things. It's one of those moments in Beethoven's career that doesn't fit so tidily in the narratives, and particularly this music somehow seems at odds with the heroic music that flanks it on either side, and I think it's kind of set critics in a little bit of a tailspin because they don't know what to do with it.
For people who don't know, what are these three periods? And we're talking about the middle period right now, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, going back to like basically the 1820s or even a little bit earlier, there was a notion that Beethoven's career could be divided into distinct periods. And in the later 19th century, this kind of codified into like an early period where Beethoven was said to be like imitating Haydn and Mozart and basically coming to grips with the style. The middle period where he branched out and started writing heroic music like his Third and Fifth Symphonies, his opera Fidelio. And then the late period, which like for a while was considered essentially a descent into madness. But then in the 20th century really became reclaimed as like extremely
futuristic genius, right?
Futuristic, path-breaking genius music. Yeah.
Okay, so and you mentioned what's really interesting about your book is, like you said, there are these lyrical and spacious and serene works that really do seem out of place with the so-called heroic decade. So, how does that happen then? Is it so? Surely, something's wrong here.
I think that the thing that has driven the way we think about Beethoven's music in the middle period is this idea of the heroic. And it's really bound up not just with the music, but with the biography. And it has to do especially with the fact of Beethoven coming to grips with the onset of deafness. He wrote a very famous note in 1802 called the Heiligenstadt Testament, where he sort of poured out his feelings and essentially said he was on the verge of committing suicide because of this realization that he was going deaf. And so that nexus of issues, the psychological, the biographical, and the musical, have been really powerful. And then when you see a piece like the Fourth Symphony, for example, which doesn't seem to want to go there, it's not about struggling against impossible odds. It's a very different kind of piece.
Yeah.
It confuses things when you have that narrative in mind. So you need a different way of looking at those pieces.
Let's also paint the picture of his career at that moment. Was he doing well in 1806?
He was doing well, but he was in a bit of a transition in the sense that when he arrived in Vienna in 1792, he was already cultivating relationships with aristocratic patrons. But that patronage was becoming more tenuous by 1806. He had the support he had immense support from Prince Lobkowitz and Prince Lichnowsky, the latter of which kind of was beginning to drop off. They had something of a falling out. But he had others who were entering in his life, such as Archduke Rudolph and Count Razumovsky. But at the same time, it was clear to Beethoven, I think, that he had to make it as a sort of free market musician if he was going to continue his career, because the patronage system was sort of under a lot of pressure economically. And so he was in between those two worlds and trying to navigate that.
Before we move forward into the book, Professor Ferraguto, can you give a broad stroke description of Beethoven's music education?
Sure. So Beethoven, was born in Bonn near the French side of Germany, the Rhine River. And his early education was mainly centered around Christian Gottlob Neefe's training. And Neefe seems to have imparted in him some good compositional habits, and also, I think, a lot of philosophical sort of ideas and ideals. I think, he was involved with the Lesegesellschaft, this sort of reading society in Bonn, which was obsessed with sort of Enlightenment thought. And I think he imparted those ideas to Beethoven as well. As to like the technical side, it's very interesting, and there's a lot there. I mean, when Beethoven moved to Vienna, it was to study with Joseph Haydn, and which he did, and he did species counterpoint exercises. He studied Fuchs, as one did at that time. There's and I think he was well versed in other treatises, Mattezone, Sulzer, and probably quite a few others. But in general, he had started as more of a pianist, and then gradually found his way toward composition as a full-time endeavor in the 1800s, I would say.
Was he a child prodigy in the same vein as Mozart?
Yes and no. I've thought about this question a bit because, his first published composition was written at age 11 or 12, depending on who you believe, because Neefe might have misrepresented his age and Beethoven didn't know his own age, his own birthday. Right. But it's a set of variations in C minor. And there are other works from that early sort of childhood period. I wouldn't say that Beethoven was a prodigy on the same level as Mozart or Mendelssohn, though. I think he was compositionally sort of more of a late bloomer, in my opinion. Somebody might come along and say, no, these early works are really brilliant, but to me, as a child composer, he didn't have the same like facility that Mozart and Mendelssohn did.
I read an anecdote that he could play all the preludes and fugues of Bach. Is that something that he was doing as a young kid?
That certainly was, and I think that was also something that Neefe imparted to him. Bach, we kind of have to remember, was not like widely known at that time as he is now, or as he was, in the 19th century. It was a little bit more rarefied, but that was an important thing. And Neefe, when he published a little notice about Beethoven, was keen to emphasize he plays the Well Tempered Clavier of J.S. Bach. That was an important sort of mark of distinction, I think, for him as an early musician.
And I just have one quick question before we dive into the book. And you mentioned Enlightenment, but later on, Beethoven almost speaks in romantic terms. Was Romanticism something that he was aware of as part of the culture, the climate of the time? Is the idea, because Goethe was contemporaries with Mozart, was that something that Beethoven would have read about in poetry or in literature?
Absolutely. And he set many poems by Goethe and others. That was something that was part of this cultural shift that was going on. However, I think, it's hard to classify Beethoven because of this reason, that he's sort of in between both worlds. But I think he really did hold fast to the Enlightenment ideology. And I see that in especially his optimistic outlook. I mean, and that's something that's really, I think, characteristic of his music, that even however grim it might be, you usually come out on the other side of it, like happy and renewed and like at peace. And I think that's a holdover of Enlightenment ideals.
Okay, let's jump into the book. Your first chapter, you talk about Leonore, which was an overture. And was this Beethoven dipping his hand into opera?
Yes. So the Leonore were overtures, but also the first version of his opera Fidelio. It goes by both names, and it's a little bit confusing. So this was essentially Beethoven's first opera that he composed in late 1805. It's the original version differs from the later version in the sense that it's only in 2 acts, and there are a lot of other 3 acts. I'm sorry, it's in 3 acts rather than 2, and there are a lot of other differences. The premiere was not particularly successful, And I think that was partly due to the fact that Vienna was occupied by French troops at the time. He revised it over the winter and remounted it in 1806, but it was a little bit more successful, but again, not a huge smash hit by any means. And I think he sort of struggled as an opera composer.
Was it not his thing, basically?
I think Fidelio in the final version and Leonore in its original version are wonderful operas. But my personal feeling on this is that he never quite had the sense of dramatic pacing that Mozart had. Mozart had such a keen sense of the stage. He had much more experience in that area. I think Beethoven struggled to get it to get it right. And he, the fact that he reworked this opera so many times is, I think, a testament to that. Something
happened as well is the introduction or the appearance of Luigi Cherubini. And did that have some kind of effect on Fidelio?
Yeah, so right around 1805, 1806, I mean, Cherubini was a hugely popular in Vienna, and French opera had swept through Vienna. And of course, Beethoven's opera was also based on a French libretto. But when Cherubini arrived in Vienna, now this figure who he revered, but who was just way more experienced than he, was right there in his circle and in his face. And so it was a little bit unfortunate timing because Cherubini also had an opera premiere called Finiska right around the time of Leonore. And Finiska was a huge success, whereas Leonore was basically had a few performances and then was taken down. So I think that didn't help things. He might have been more successful had Cherubini not been there at the time.
Did he have good things to say about contemporaries, or was he a tough critic? And what was his opinion about Cherubini?
He was definitely a tough critic about most musicians, and he didn't hold back.
Can you give some examples?
Yeah, I mean, a good one would be like Anton Reicha, who was somebody that Beethoven grew up with in Bonn. Anton Reicha published a set of fugues that are quite interesting. They're in all kinds of wacky meters, and they break the rules of fugues. But Beethoven said something to the effect of, he's basically written a set of fugues that are no longer fugues, and they just weren't interesting to him. And so I think he had no trouble pointing out the flaws of other composers. Now, then there were a few that he held in high regard. Cherubini was one of them. Mozart was one of them. Haydn was one of them, although he had some issues with Haydn too. But it helped if they were dead. Right. Like Bach and Handel were two others that he held in high esteem because they couldn't compete with him.
What is Beethoven's Italian connection? Is there an Italian connection with Beethoven?
That's a really great question. It's hard to answer. For me, I mean, there was a huge thriving Italian opera scene in Vienna. You had people like Antonio Salieri, who was a court composer in Vienna for a long time. You had the operas of Mozart that were, many of them in Italian. It was something he could not have avoided. And it was something that certainly played a part in the way he constructed his music. He had also studied with Salieri, for example, studied vocal composition with him. And would have regularly interacted with Italian composers. Now, how precisely he leveraged Italian music versus Germanic and French music is a really complex question because everything was kind of converging in Vienna at that time.
Now, let's go on to another chapter, which you talk about his fourth piano concerto and his violin concerto. Were they also composed 1806? And we talk about the terminology of the word virtuoso.
Right. So the fourth piano concerto was started a little bit earlier, but completed in 1806. And the violin concerto was composed basically entirely in 1806. And the word virtuoso, yeah, I mean, this is something that I kind of spend quite a bit of time on in the book because neither of these pieces fits the traditional mold of the sort of virtuoso concerto. It's not that they lack technical difficulty, but they're less in your face. They're not as bombastic. And when you look into what people were saying about virtuosity at this time, there was sort of this rising notion of the true virtuoso as somebody who embodied expressiveness versus the charlatan or the imposter, right? And you could see that discourse playing out all the way through the 19th and 20th centuries with especially people like Liszt, but it was kind of crystallizing right now. And I think that we need to look at these two concertos as evidence that Beethoven had a broader view of what virtuosity was, and that incorporated expressiveness and interiority, and that there's a certain like showmanship in bringing us to those moments of intense interiority that it makes us almost flip the idea of virtuosity on its head.
I'm curious because you also mentioned that you had some little-known sources that you infused into your book. Can you mention some of these new sources that would be of interest to people studying Beethoven?
Sure. Well, one of them actually has to do with virtuosity, and it's this essay by Carl Friedrich Triest on traveling virtuosos, which is not unknown, but has been little studied. I translate a good amount of it in the book. I think it's really interesting because there's not a whole lot of scholarship on the idea of virtuosity at this time. Most of it has to do with the sort of Liszt period. That might be one thing. There's also some stuff in the chapter about the Razumovsky quartets that has to do with Beethoven's use of Russian themes that I think might also be interesting to people who are interested in that topic. I mean, the idea of incorporating Russian melodies into music was something that was written about, and there was even a tune published in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, this journal that has a very close resemblance to the melody of the Andante in Opus 59, number 3, which is one of these controversial pieces that might be Russian or might not be Russian. So there's little things along the way that might pique people's interest in that sense.
That's the next thing I wanted to bring up. But just before we move on, there's so many things that actually relate between the chapters. Like for instance, the fourth piano concerto, that was affected by, and we're going to talk about the French piano, the Érard, later. But can you talk about how that particular piano influenced the composition of the concerto?
Sure. So, well, maybe I'll just mention that piano because Beethoven acquired a French piano in around 1803 from the firm of Érard. And it was long thought that this piano was a gift from the firm. The firm had gifted Haydn a piano, but now it's been uncovered that he actually was charged for the piano and apparently never paid the bill. The piano had a lot of neat aspects to it, and one of them that has to do with the fourth piano concerto is this una corda pedal, which was a true una corda in the sense that it shifts the action onto one string, and also allows you to progress from one string to two strings to three strings, that is corresponding to each note on the keyboard. And Beethoven uses that in the middle movement of the fourth piano concerto, and he has these wonderful crescendo effects where he asks you to gradually lift the dampers so essentially using this new technological device of the una corda to create an even more impressive sense of crescendo and diminuendo.
The violin concerto is part of the repertoire, I believe, right? I mean, I'm not a violinist, but
sure.
It's a really popular piece. And if we could talk about how it's perceived and how it's analyzed, and is it a virtuoso piece?
Yeah, I mean, it is. You're absolutely right that it's a part of it's a staple of the repertoire. It's one of the big violin concertos. But it's not a virtuoso piece in the usual sense. It is difficult. Intonation-wise, it's extremely difficult. Beethoven loves this super high register, which is very difficult to play in. He's always way up in the stratosphere, and there is difficult passage work, but it's on the whole a much more kind of serene and really luxuriant piece in the sense that There's a lot of internal repetition. It's almost like a block-like construction in the sense that he'll give you a huge stretch of music and then maybe repeat that later in a different key or something like that. And it just feels like this huge world. It's not a particularly driving piece. It's a piece that takes its time and in which you kind of luxuriate in the sound, I think, and that sound world.
Now, by contrast, the fourth piano concerto is not perhaps as famous as the Emperor. So talk about the distinctive features of that fourth piano concerto musically.
Yeah, I mean, from the get-go, that piece is really extraordinary. I don't know if you can hear if I play a little excerpt on the piano.
Yeah.
But the beginning of that piece starts with the piano playing rather than with the orchestra, which is very atypical. So the piano comes in G major, and then the orchestra comes in totally in the wrong key or in a different key with its own idea in B major. Back to G.
G to B, wow.
It's extraordinary. And so the idea of starting with the piano and starting with this very original gambit, and then having the orchestra come in this sort of other world is really cool. And then I think throughout the piece, the piano is always sort of getting lost in its own thoughts, I guess I would say. Like there's a driving forward, but then he'll move to, for example, flat 6 or something like that, and you'll have this wonderful theme in the piano that just seems like it's sort of looking off into the distance. And I think that to me is what sets this concerto apart from something like the Emperor, which you mentioned, which is really a driving kind of piece. And actually, I think of it in terms of topics, because it's essentially like slow movement topics, lyricism. Stuff you would find in a slow movement. For example, in the slow movement of the Emperor Concerto, you find that in the opening movement of the fourth piano concerto. It's almost like this weird topical mixture that it seems to almost combine the aesthetics of a slow movement with the opening sonata allegro movement or concerto allegro movement.
One thing that really interested me about what you said about virtuosos is there's the importance of the expressiveness. So Beethoven was a great improviser and he had that power to his playing. Did the public want that? I mean, for instance, when I do believe later in France, you had the flying so-called trapeze of piano playing school, and everyone was unbelievable, 16th notes everywhere, just fantastic. Yeah. But did the public at that point in time, was there an urge for that kind of music? Or what are the motivations to write more lyrical, pastoral, relaxing, serene pieces?
That's a wonderful question. And I think there must have been a demand for both. I mean, because there's a lot of music produced that is extremely technical. But at the same time, people like Mozart and Beethoven, who were completely capable of that, also railed against it and basically said, this music is trashy. So you have Mozart, for example, who basically writes to his father about Clementi, that he was a mere mechanicus. Oof. And that he could only play parallel thirds and it was basically like this surface level music, whereas Mozart was writing something deeper. So I think as there was this culture of like the general musical public and then also those who considered themselves connoisseurs, you have composers being pushed in both directions. All the time, basically. And so you would end up on either side of that divide, or you would try to come to a way of combining the two impulses in a new way, which I think Beethoven does.
Now we turn to Opus 59, the Razumovsky String Quartets. And I didn't know this, but he got a roasting for these compositions. I had no idea. He got roasted. And in particular, Joseph Kerman.
Yes.
So he said, he was savage. Was there a perception that Beethoven was making fun of Russians? Or what's the real situation here?
Yeah, I mean, the roasting is interesting. And I think it started in the 19th century and then kind of picked up traction in the 20th. And the thinking behind it is that okay, so to take a step back, Beethoven took two Russian themes from a collection that was published in 1790, and he incorporated them into the first and second Razumovsky quartets, which were, of course, dedicated to the Russian ambassador in Vienna, Andrei Razumovsky. In doing that, though, he made a lot of changes to those themes. He sped up the tempos. He changed some of the rhythmic aspects, and in doing so, it has been argued that he dishonored the original intent of those themes.
Well, is that a contemporary criticism or later on?
It's a contemporary. It's a modern criticism. Okay. It's like it, and mainly Kerman and Richard Cheruskin has also advanced a similar idea, and it has to do with, for example, the tune in Opus 59 Number 1, which sounds like this. Okay, that tune was my Russian pronunciation is no good, but prodigy, which was a sort of lamenting song. Okay, and it's sped up by Beethoven and used as a theme for an allegro finale, and then it's subjected to all kinds of contrapuntal treatments, which some critics have felt is out of character for that theme. And then similarly with the theme in Opus 59 Number 2, which sounds like this. He takes it on this contrapuntal like roller coaster ride in the trio of Opus 59 Number 2, and basically, some of the language that people have used about that is it's been robbed of its identity, it's been beaten down, it's been he's killing it. Basically, that's what the thinking has been on that. I don't personally hear it that way, and I think what he was trying to do is elevate these themes through this idea of counterpoint, and to create something almost sort of a sublime and highly like learned, sophisticated approach to these themes. And you've got to keep in mind that this set of quartets was dedicated to somebody who was very helpful to him, who basically opened up his palace as a laboratory to Beethoven. He let him use his house quartet, the Schuppanzee Quartet.
Nice.
And he was, exactly. And he was also a string player himself and a connoisseur he supported the quartets of Haydn and Beethoven. And so the idea that Beethoven would have used this opportunity to make fun of Russians or Russian music, to me, just makes no sense.
What does it mean by the learned approach or style? And that obviously has a connotation of being contrasted with something else.
Yes, that's a great question. So the idea of learned style has to do with music that is overtly, let's say, conspicuously designed for connoisseurs. And it often would take the form of a sort of reversion to stile antico principles. It could be the use of counterpoint or fugue. We talk about it as a musical topic. If you think of a symphony by Haydn, for example, you might have in the development section a passage that is a fugato. And we would call that like a little bit of learned style, and then it might switch to something else, singing style or military style or something like that. So it's become a topic in the sense of topic theory, which is a kind of hot area in 18th century theory, as you know. It's used not, if learned style was sort of a default style in some respects in the Baroque period, it's more of a choice in Beethoven's time. It's a backward-looking gesture in a sense. It looks back. It's didactic. It's pedagogical. It's Baroque, and it's out of step with the usual expressive kind of language.
Is that a modern or contemporary description of the music
as being stile antico or as being learned?
Yeah.
It is. I mean, those terms were certainly used in the 18th century, and I think contemporaries recognized when music was overtly oriented toward connoisseurs versus toward the general public. And this is certainly an example of that. And Beethoven, not only are there these treatments of the Russian themes, which are very contrapuntal and unusual, and they use all kinds of interesting devices like canon and recombination. But in the third quartet, the whole opus is concluded with a big fugal movement, essentially. So it's clear that was something, that impulse was important to Beethoven in conceiving these quartets.
Now we move on to the Fourth Symphony, which right after the Eroica, this is Opus 60. And so actually, can we set the stage here? It's been referred to as Haydnesque. And how famous was Haydn in 1806?
Haydn was Beyonce in 1806. Haydn was probably the most famous composer in all of Europe. Widely published, with the London symphonies in the 1790s, and then with the Creation and the Seasons, his two big oratorios in the early 1800s. Haydn had amassed a huge following that was international in scope, and I don't think had really been touched by the likes of any other composer prior to him. By 1806, though, Haydn, the man, was sort of suffering. I mean, he had sort of dementia. He was getting old. He wasn't really composing much anymore. He was there in Vienna, but he had sort of receded in a sense from the public limelight. But he was a force to be reckoned with, and I think somebody who Beethoven emulated, but was also anxious about his relationship toward.
The Third Symphony is definitely an archetypical heroic piece. So this Fourth Symphony, is this a regression? What's happening here?
It's certainly different, and a lot of people have viewed it as a regression. To me, I struggle with that idea because, then we're basically taking the Eroica as the sole criterion of value, or that Beethoven has to be doing the heroic for him to be truly Beethoven. And I think he's somebody who's always exploring new directions. And the same is true with the Pastoral Symphony. It's a completely different direction. The Fourth Symphony has some qualities that we could link with the idea of the heroic style. But in general, I would say it doesn't espouse those ideals, and he's grasping in different directions.
Let's talk about his 32 variations in C minor. And your chapter was music for a French piano. So let's really now talk about this new piano. What was the brand? And you mentioned that he had to pay for it, right? But he didn't.
Yes,
he didn't actually pay for it. So let's talk about the French piano here and how it led to the 32 variations.
Right. So the piano was made by the firm of Érard. It still exists. It's in I can't remember. It's in Austria. It's in Graz, I think, or Linz. Now I can't remember. It's in the book. But it's not playable anymore, of course. So this piano was different from the Viennese pianos that Beethoven was used to. It's different because it's heavier in construction. It had a more expanded keyboard of 5.5 octaves. Typically, the Viennese pianos up to that point had 5 octaves. It also uses, this is where it gets a little confusing, but there were two kinds of actions in pianos. There was the English action and the Viennese action. And Viennese action is very precise, and it allows for really meticulous articulation. The English action was designed for larger spaces. It creates a more resonant and more vibrant sound. It's a little bit less precise than the Viennese action. The Érard piano, which is a French piano, uses an English action. That's where it gets a little bit confusing. So this was a new kind of piano for Beethoven. And it was something that initially he was absolutely thrilled with. I think it was very inspiring to him in the few years, 1803 to 1806, in terms of writing piano music and writing other music. And then he kind of, the love affair ended.
Why?
And, well, it's certainly at some point he found that the action was too heavy, and he had a builder make adjustments to it to lighten it up and make it closer to the Viennese action that he was accustomed to. And then, for whatever reason, he sort of let it fall into disrepair, and he didn't keep up his relationship with it. And I don't know if that was because the action he ultimately found was not his cup of tea, or for whatever other reason. But it seems like he then sort of started to rely more on Viennese pianos again. He would eventually get a Broadwood piano later in his career too, which he used for his late piano music. So it's a very limited amount of time that this piano was used by him, but I think it's an important thing to take into consideration.
Can you talk about the features of the 32 variations? Is there an evolution here in piano writing? Because Beethoven did write a lot of variations in his career. What are the distinctive features of this composition?
Yeah, so this piece is really kind of an outlier in terms of his variation sets because it again kind of looks back to the Baroque period. It's based on a descending chromatic tetrachord. It's basically like a chaconne set of variation, a chaconne or a passacaglia, more than a set of classical variations. I'll play the opening of the theme. It's only 8 bars long.
I love live playing on the show. It's really fun. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, it's nice to hear some examples, I think, to
no, it's great.
But that little theme is only 8 bars long, and there's not much to it. But for that reason, Beethoven's able to use it as a springboard for all kinds of really interesting pianistic variations. And so that set of variations, to me, is about like exploring different kinds of touch, different kinds of articulation, different patterns of figuration. And it really looks back to Handel, who composed variations in a similar manner. It's a very old-fashioned set of variations in that way. But then on the other hand, it's exploring these new aspects of his French piano. So it's bringing those two things into dialogue in a really interesting way.
Opus 62 is the Coriolan Overture. And I guess some people have said it's a return to this overtly heroic musical theme. Let's talk about that now. That also sits with Leonore as well in 1806. Talk a little bit about its composition and the features of it and why it's interesting in this microhistory.
Sure. So the Coriolan Overture is technically composed early 1807. I included it in the book, though, because it formed the last work in a set of pieces that Beethoven marketed as a group, which includes all the other pieces that we've been talking about today, basically, or most of them. As you said, though, it's contemporary with the Leonore overtures, and it is heroic in the sense that, okay, it's in C minor. It's based on a heroic play, which was the Coriolanist play by his contemporary Heinrich von Collin. And what makes it differ from pieces like the Eroica or the Fifth Symphony, which is also in C minor, is that it doesn't end triumphantly, right? With the heroic style, we usually think, okay, we're going to go through this really difficult, painful process and then emerge restored at the end. This piece, you don't emerge restored. You basically emerge dead and beaten down at the end. Poor Coriolan meets his fate at the end. Depends which version of the story you read, but in Collin's play, he commits suicide because he's so tortured about his betrayal of Rome. So it ends in death, essentially. And I think so. In that sense, yeah, it's both heroic and not heroic, and a really interesting piece to look at in terms of Beethoven's larger output.
Why did you name the chapter For a Playwright, and what's the significance of that with the writing of this overture?
Right. So the reception history of this piece, there's been a long-standing effort to disconnect it from Collin, who was the playwright for which it was originally written, and to associate it with Shakespeare's play of Coriolanus. I think the thinking was, this overture is phenomenal. How could it have been based on this really ponderous play by this unknown German playwright? The inspiration must have been Shakespearean. But Beethoven certainly knew his Shakespeare and read Shakespeare, but there's no evidence that he knew Shakespeare's Coriolanus. And the commission clearly came from Colleen, and it was even performed at least once with the play by Colleen. So to me, if we're going to really understand this piece, we need to look at it in dialogue with that particular play and that playwright.
We close the book with a chapter called Everyday Beethoven. What was your intention and what does that mean, the everyday Beethoven?
Yeah, so it goes back to this idea of we're looking at Beethoven through a telescope when we talk about these periods in his career, and the efforts of basically the book was designed around trying to take a more microscopic view and examine the day-to-day activities of Beethoven as they related to his music. I think by doing that we gain a different perspective on what he was doing, and that maybe then we come back to the macro narrative and we say, okay, actually this macro narrative needs to change, because when we look at it on a micro scale, we're realizing it doesn't really, the macro narrative doesn't really make sense. So I think by engaging with the everyday Beethoven, we come to a new view of what he was doing compositionally and what directions he was trying to move in.
What were the most surprising things you discovered in the course of your research?
Oh, that's a tough one. I suppose one of the most interesting things to me was how aggressively Beethoven pursued the management of his own reputation, engagement with publishers, marketing to a certain extent, and that this was a big part of the composer's job in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I think it's a part of the job that this kind of working with the intermediaries of the system, the critics, the publishers, the performers, is something that we can easily overlook when we're really focused on, okay, let's analyze this sonata form piece, or let's get ready to perform this piano sonata. And once you start looking into all that nitty gritty, then I think new things about these pieces start to pop up to you. And that to me, I think was the most revelatory thing.
How has Beethoven research changed over the last couple of decades?
I think Beethoven research has become a lot more attuned to context. On the analytical side of things, there's still a steady stream of interest in certain aspects of his music. I mean, with the publication of the Hapokoski-Darcy book, I think there was a renewed interest in his sonata forms. Topic theory is a really big area of interest right now. Schemata theory is coming up with people like Vasily Biros, who I know you've interviewed on your show. That's too. Right. Yeah, I mean, but it's always this funny balance of all of this contextual work and all of this very detailed work coming up against the big story and the big biographies of Beethoven. And I think they still, to me, sit in a very uneasy relationship, and it's going to be, it may never be possible to resolve those two and come to, that's just the job of what we do. We're always trying to revise and revisit and stuff like that. But that narrative is so powerful that it kind of sweeps a lot of this stuff under the rug. And so in my mind, I think the job of Beethoven scholars right now is to try to get that level of precision and detail and richness into the mainstream.
I want to get your take on this. Professor of Musicology at Kent State University, Professor Theodore Albrecht, said in a reasonably well-covered story around February, not only was Beethoven not completely deaf at the premiere of his Ninth Symphony in May 1824, he could hear, although increasingly faintly, for at least 2 years afterwards, probably through the last premiere that he would supervise his string quartet in B flat, Opus 130, in March 1826. Now, what do you make of that? Was Beethoven actually not deaf?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that Beethoven's deafness was not total has been around for a while. And it's clear that it could not have been total because he was still using ear trumpets, right, at the end of his life. How well they worked is another question. And he also commissioned this extraordinary resonator, which was kind of like a shield that went around his piano so that he could pick up more of the vibrations. So it's clear that he had enough hearing that he was trying to make these interventions and pull out the sound and be able to register what he could. And deafness is such a complex thing that it's not like, I would highly recommend, by the way, Robin Wallace's recent book on hearing Beethoven, where he describes this sort of in and out quality of deafness, right? It's often not like a binary thing, but people do retain some of their hearing or certain frequencies. I think with Theodor Albrecht's recent work, he's provided more evidence that Beethoven's hearing loss was uneven and that he had good days and bad, even if many people think he was totally stone deaf, but I think it's more complicated than that.
Oh, that's really interesting. Now, I want to have a bit of fun just before we end. We only have a couple of minutes left, but word of mouth is like the best kind of recommendation when it comes to anything. So, Professor Ferraguto, some Beethoven music you can recommend. In fact, even the bars that you can recommend. If there's certain sections that move you so much from any of the works that you've mentioned, or even beyond or before 1806, word of mouth. Let's have it. So, like, if somebody was going to listen to Beethoven, what are the sections of music that you think people should really check out?
What a great question. My mind first goes to the slow movement of the Fourth Symphony, which I think is one of the best movements in all of Beethoven and is honestly not known by many people. It's extremely beautiful. It has a section in the middle where he just puts you in this floating state where it's just really ambiguous in a beautiful way. There's also an extremely powerful passage, and I was thinking of this last night because of the rule of the octave, which is, I know, something you talk about a lot on this show.
I talk about it, but I don't know if I know it really well.
I don't know if I do either, frankly, but there's a wonderful passage that's basically harmonizing a descending scale in that movement with some dissonances thrown in. Let's see if I can manage it on the keyboard here. The movement's in E flat major, and he goes to E flat minor. He does something like this. It's so beautiful, and here played by the orchestra. It's in the somewhere in the middle of the movement there. It's one of the few moments in the Fourth Symphony where we leave the realm of peacefulness and serenity, and all of a sudden he whacks you in the face, and it's, I think, very beautiful. I guess beyond that, I mean, there's so many wonderful passages. The first movement of the Fourth Piano Concerto is really extraordinary from beginning to end. And if you're already familiar with that movement, I might suggest that you take a look at there was a version of that concerto that was arranged for a string quintet and piano. Beethoven may have had a hand in the arrangement. And there's a recording of it by John Elliott Gardner and his ensemble. And it's really neat to hear that work in such an intimate format. So I definitely recommend checking that out as well.
Well, Professor Ferraguto, it was such a pleasure to have you on the program to share your expertise. The book is Beethoven 1806, published by Oxford University Press. Very, very interesting. Go check it out. By the way, if people want to contact you or find more of your research, how can they do it?
I am I teach at Pennsylvania State University, so I have my email address and everything on their website. I also have an academia.edu profile, which people can visit and download some of my stuff too.
Wonderful. Well, fantastic. Professor Ferraguto, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Nikhil.